For generations, deep within the United States, families lived on the sidelines of society, a legacy of consanguinity preserved that deformed and destroyed its own strains. Hidden in the shadows of the story, far from the eyes of the public, incest cases and their genetic consequences were never fully revealed. The obscure secrets of families whose stories were silenced and distorted over time are revealed in this documentary. We will explore the real cases of families whose lineages were devastated by generations of marriages between relatives, leading to a stigma that echoes to this day, along with physical deformities and diseases. More than only the story of a forbidden act is shown by what these families faced and the impact their choices had for the following generations, the consequences of guarded secrets and how they changed the fate of many are laid bare. While we travel to the region of the Appalachians where the history of the Kellogg family began, hidden from public view and ignored for many years, the camera focuses on old images with the vision of isolated villages and faces that carry the scars of the past. Check to see if you are already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose more rare and impactful stories that are carefully hidden from the eyes of the public. The history of the Kellogg family began in a remote region of the Appalachians where the outside world seemed distant and the possibilities of marriages outside the community were practically non-existent. A closed cycle was created by geographical and social limitations, a cycle where marriages between relatives were often the only option. A devastating legacy of consanguinity that would forever mark the following generations would soon become what began as a seemingly innocent and common practice at the time. In an isolated area of West Virginia during the early years of the 19th century, members of the Kellogg family were known for their simple experience, focused on the basic needs of survival. Formed by few families who knew each other very well and depended on each other for support was the community, located in the mountains of Appalachia. The idea of marriage outside the community was practically unthinkable, and there was no easy access to other villages or cities. The first marriage within the Kellogg family itself occurred around 1820, according to local records, when Ezekiel Kellogg, a young family member, married his cousin Sarah Kellogg, who, like him, came from the same small community. Heck now if you are already subscribed to the channel. A practical solution was how the marriage was seen. Minimal were the options outside the community, and due to isolation, the idea of preserving the lineage in the family was considered normal. This kind of union between cousins repeated itself over the years, practice perpetuated within the family itself. A combination of factors motivated the first act of family incest: the isolation, the scarcity of new people in the region, and a particular view of the preservation of the family lineage. A shared decision among family members who saw this as a way to strengthen family ties and ensure the continuity of family business and land. It was not a case of forcing. Without real knowledge about genetic effects, the choices were made for social and economic convenience. James Kellogg was born in 1821, the first child of the union after the marriage of Ezekiel and Sarah. Physical characteristics that immediately caused strangeness in the community were presented by James. Facial deformities, motor difficulties, and a delay in cognitive development were what he had, making him unable to communicate properly. Attributed to unknown factors were these problems due to the lack of understanding of genetics at that time, and the community did not associate these difficulties with a common marriage practice among close relatives. Gradually clear became the physical impact of marriages between cousins. Similar health problems began to be had by the children and grandchildren of the first couples, such as more pronounced facial deformities, difficulty in mobility, severe cognitive disabilities, and even heart disease. However, the practice of marriage between family members continued largely due to the lack of external options and a stigma that involved deviation from the community standard. Repeated in the following years were marriages within the family. His first cousin, Mary Kellogg, was married by John Kellogg, Ezekiel's nephew and son of James, in 1850. Considered by the community as acceptable and even necessary was this marriage, like the previous ones. Several children were had by the couple, many of whom were born with the same health problems observed in previous generations, including microcephaly, movement difficulties, and facial anomalies. Increasingly evident began to become the physical consequences of such unions, but practice continued to be considered a necessity in the small community. Also deep was the emotional impact. On the fringes of society have many family members begun to live, unable to connect with others and often victims of isolation. Palpable were the shame and stigma around malformations and cognitive deficiency. However, drowned out by the insistence of keeping the family united and strong according to community traditions were these feelings of guilt and shame often. Heck now if you are already subscribed to the channel. Remained over the decades has the wedding cycle between cousins and close relatives in the Kellogg family. A new generation of descendants came together within the same lineage in 1880, and once again, the consequences were devastating. His aunt, Eliza Kellogg, was married by William Kellogg, son of John and Mary, leading to the creation of a new generation of individuals with severe physical and mental disabilities. No longer questioned within the family were these weddings. For the Kelloggs, it was a common and even expected practice. Non-existent was knowledge about genetics and the risks of consanguinity, and health difficulties were for many attributed to bad luck. However, the family began to be seen with more distance from neighboring communities with the increase in deformities and diseases. A worsening of the physical and emotional conditions of family members was led to by the intensification of isolation and the lack of medical and social support. Treated for many years as an isolated and hidden case was the history of the Kellogg family. The true extension of the consequences of consanguinity was only beginning to be understood in the early 20th century with the advent of new genetic research. The continuous practice of marriages between relatives was revealed in 1920 by the few surviving members of the family seeking help outside the community. The direct result of the repetition of consanguineous marriages were the observed physical and mental problems, found by genetics experts when studying family records. Gradually being published in scientific articles over time was the history of the Kellogg family, later discussed in consanguinity and genetic studies. However, the weight of shame continued to be lived with by the local community and many family members who were still alive, often ignoring the truth about their lineage. Something deep about the consequences of ignorance and social isolation is taught to us by the Kellogg family legacy. A legacy of social isolation and shame that lasted for generations was created by the family consanguinity cycle, which not only resulted in physical deformities. A need to protect their identity and dignity was the reason why many were led to hide their history by the stigma associated with these practices, not out of malice. Inevitable becomes the reflection on our own social standards as we begin to understand the consequences of consanguinity. How many families live in secret with similar stories not yet revealed to the world? What stories are being hidden from us today? What does this say about human nature and our tendency to protect what is easier to ignore? Comment now if you also feel the weight of this story. Not all families deserve to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, which need to be heard and understood. From the shadows in a small town in Western Virginia where isolation and generations of consanguinity intertwine emerged the history of the Whitaker family, bringing out the devastating effects of a lack of information on genetics. Maintained for years was the secret, with family members living on the fringes of society, carrying a stigma they should never have carried. Extreme consequences leaving an indelible mark in subsequent generations would be led to by what started with weddings between close cousins and the repetition of ancestral practices. Not only about the Whitaker family is the following story, but about how isolation and ignorance can transform lives and perpetuate suffering for several generations. To the 1800s dates back the history of the Whitaker family, when the first generations of this lineage settled in Western Virginia, an isolated and difficult-to-access region. Predominantly farmers were the family members, who lived in a small community where social relations were limited. The only viable option for preserving the family name and maintenance of properties became marriages between family members due to the lack of access to formal education and the distance from urban centers. In the late 1800s occurred the first case of family incest, when Edward Whitaker, a young family member, married his first cousin, Margaret Whitaker. Considered acceptable within the community was the union since both were children of close branches of the same family tree, and marriage between cousins was not uncommon in isolated families where the population was small and the options to form new alliances were limited. Voluntary was the decision to marry, although there was no deep understanding of the genetic implications this could cause. Not aware of the risks that consanguinity would imply were Edward and Margaret, like many other community members. A matter of convenience and tradition, not scientific knowledge, was marriage for them. No widely accessible studies on the risks of incest and its consequences for the health of the descendants existed at the time. Ray Whitaker was the couple's first child, born in 1890. A severe microcephaly was what he had, a rare condition characterized by an abnormal development of the brain which caused serious cognitive deficiencies. Significant motor difficulties were also faced by Ray, unable to walk without help and presenting a profound mental delay. Not immediately attributed to consanguinity were these symptoms. But over time, clear it became that serious genetic problems had been given rise to by the repetition of marriages between cousins and close relatives. Just the first of many descendants of the Whitaker family to face the consequences of generations of consanguinity was Ray. His quality of life was not only affected by his physical and mental condition, but he was also stigmatized before society, leading the family to live in even deeper isolation. The lives of other family members who were repeating the same patterns and suffering the same physical and emotional consequences were shaped by the difficulties that Ray faced. So intense was the shame and stigma associated with Ray's condition that for many years the family was avoided by other inhabitants of the region who did not understand the causes of the health problems that affected the Whitaker lineage. With the family being increasingly isolated from society, incapable of forming relationships with other members of the community, this stigma perpetuated for generations. Only in 2004 was the history of the Whitaker family brought to the greater public when filmmaker Mark Laita, known for documenting the stories of marginalized people, visited the family to record its reality. A documentary that exposed the living conditions of the Whitakers was filmed by Laita, revealing to the world the devastating effects of consanguinity in an isolated lineage. The harsh reality of the family was not only exposed by Laita's documentary Soft White Underbelly, but the genetic issues that affected the Whitakers were also brought to light. A turning point for the public understanding of the effects of consanguinity was the film, clearly showing how choices made in past generations continue to impact the physical and mental health of future generations. Massive was the repercussion of the documentary, generating a wave of discussions about the genetic risks of consanguinity, especially in isolated communities. Although many watched the documentary with shock and compassion, the story also raised crucial questions about the lack of education and awareness about genetic effects in the small rural communities of the United States. A milestone in the discussion about consanguinity and its consequences for health was the case of the Whitaker family. Not only the genetic and social problems faced by the family were exposed by Mark Laita's documentary, but it also questioned how a lack of genetic information and social isolation can result in practices that, without scientific knowledge, are devastating to the health of future generations. The need for genetic education and public policies to prevent consanguinity practices in isolated communities where access to information is limited was brought to light by the case. The discussion about the social impact of consanguinity also expanded, with experts stating that it is essential to offer educational resources and awareness for these populations so that they can make informed choices about their relationships. In addition, not just for the members of the Whitaker family, but for the entire community that watched the documentary, the emotional impact of the story was deep. A recurring theme in the discussions after the film's screening was the shame, the isolation, and the lack of psychological support for those involved. The discovery that several members of the Whitaker family had tried to move away from the lineage and seek new paths, but due to isolation and a lack of opportunities, they ended up returning to the cycle of consanguinity, was one of the most amazing revelations of Laita's documentary. Aware of the implications of their history and seeking help were many of the family's latest descendants. But in many cases, help was not enough, as the genetic consequences were so deep. A deep reflection on how choices made by one generation can affect future ones is led to by the history of the Whitaker family, especially when the knowledge and the resources needed to understand these choices are not accessible. A practice that arose from need and ignorance was the repetition of incest in the family, not an act of malice or force, and its consequences were devastating. The weight of a legacy they have not chosen continues to be carried by the younger generations, haunted by the stigma, the shame, and the physical and emotional consequences. A warning about the dangers of isolation and a lack of education on genetics and public health is the history of the Whitaker family in the end. It teaches us that as a society, we have the responsibility to educate and inform communities to prevent practices that can result in such deep tragedies as consanguinity. Comment now if you also feel the weight of this story. What happens when the love between relatives becomes fatal? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this which need to be heard. One of the most tragic examples of consanguinity and how it can profoundly affect the physical, mental, and emotional health of a lineage is the case of the Whitaker family. A reflection on the impact of isolation and a lack of education on genetics in the most remote communities was also provoked by the story, which was brought to light by Mark Laita, not only revealing the consequences of consanguinity. We can better understand the challenges that many communities face and work to prevent these tragedies from repeating when learning from these stories. Not just a matter of stigma was the social rejection of families affected by consanguinity, but also of institutional marginalization. For a long time, the Whitaker families were avoided by their neighbors and even by members of other families. The reason was clear. A curse was how cognitive difficulties and genetic malformations were seen, something the community preferred to ignore or not accept. How the perception of the community about the Whitaker family has always been negative is revealed in a testimonial from a former neighbor, Martha Jennings. I remember when we were children and heard stories about the Whitaker family. Everyone talked in whispers about what was happening in that house. Nobody wanted to approach. No one wanted to interact. People talked about how the children from there were disfigured and were not normal. We could not accept someone like this in our home. It was almost like a punishment to have any kind of contact with them. A deep mark in the psyche of the Whitaker family members was left by this type of social marginalization, as they were rejected not only by people but also by the health and education system. On the sidelines they lived, with difficulties to obtain appropriate medical care, and their education was neglected, as many of the family members were not considered able to attend conventional schools due to their cognitive limitations. A worsening of the situation of all involved was led to by the lack of social support, which made them live in progressive isolation. In isolation have consanguineous families such as the Whitakers learned to survive. A constant battle to maintain their survival was the daily life of these families, without the support of the outside world and with extremely limited resources. Even more difficult to live with quality of life was made by the lack of access to information on public health, education, or even psychological support. In the case of the Whitakers, in addition to the physical and psychological difficulty, there was also the challenge of maintaining dignity in a society that saw them as anomalous. Trying to live like the others were the lives of many family members, but always with the weight of a stigma that accompanied them wherever they were. A deep sense of inadequacy and lack of belonging, feelings shared by many members of the lineage, was generated by this. A rare window to their lives was provided by Mark Laita's documentary, allowing the world to know how deep the social isolation lived by the Whitaker family was. The experience of filming the family was commented on by Laita in an interview. The most impressive for me was the way they were in total imprisonment but at the same time communicated with each other in a very intimate way. There was a fortress in the way they protected themselves but at the same time an immense fragility in how they faced the world outside. It was a great privilege to document this reality but at the same time a great responsibility. How much ignorance and stigma can determine the fate of a person or a family is the deepest reflection generated by this case. Crucial questions about how society deals with the excluded and how we can change our approach to ensure that more people do not go through this kind of suffering are raised by what happened to the Whitaker family. In the heart of the mountains of eastern Kentucky took shape a peculiar and rare story of consanguinity and a genetic condition almost forgotten by time. Marked by the blue color of its skin was a family for generations, a characteristic that would make them known as the Blue Family of Troublesome Creek. Initially misunderstood and stigmatized was the condition, which would intrigue scientists and doctors. But how this lineage began and what impact the choices of their ancestors had on the next generations. A complex problem of consanguinity that would generate devastating consequences was what a seemingly simple genetic phenomenon revealed in reality. What happens when science and history intersect? How a lineage that began with a common practice at the time, marriage between relatives, resulted in such a visible and impactful condition. This is the report of the Fugate family, a blue blood history in which the color of their skin was not the only thing that differentiated them from the rest of society. To the 19th century dates back the history of the Fugate family, more precisely in the year 1820 when pioneers Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smart settled in Troublesome Creek, an isolated region in the hills of Kentucky. Martin Fugate, a man of French origin, and Elizabeth of English ancestry, were destined to form a lineage marked by a rare genetic phenomenon. What seemed to be a simple union between two members of local families would soon become the beginning of a cycle of weddings between close relatives. Not uncommon for the time was the first marriage between Martin and Elizabeth Fugate, especially in isolated communities where wedding options were limited. Without many other couples available, weddings between cousins and close relatives were acceptable and common in rural communities. What Martin and Elizabeth didn't know was that their union would give rise to a recessive gene, methemoglobinemia, which would begin to be transmitted from generation to generation, dramatically changing the life of the descendants. The phenomenon that would make the Fugate family stand out and be known as the Blue family was a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, which prevented the blood from oxygenating properly. This resulted in a bluish skin because the blood had difficulty transporting oxygen to the body's cells. When the descendants of Martin and Elizabeth were born, the visible feature of bluish skin was exhibited by many, which for many was the first sign that something unusual was happening with this lineage. Due to a mutation of the gene responsible for hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in the blood, does methemoglobinemia occur. In its most common form, the gene for this condition is recessive, which means that for a person to present the condition, she must inherit a copy of the gene from each parent. That the skin of the Fugate family members became visibly bluish did the rare condition, especially when they were in natural light, a feature that soon became a marker of their family identity. A characteristic of the family lineage became the phenomenon of blue skin with the passing of generations, with children being born with the condition due to the persistent practice of consanguineous marriages. Until the condition spread through several generations, each generation continued to perpetuate this recessive gene, creating a lineage with visible and hereditary effects. Although the condition was a medical and biological curiosity, what perpetuated it was the marriages between relatives throughout generations, including the descendants of Martin and Elizabeth. A way to maintain properties and family ties was the practice of marrying close relatives, as wedding options were limited in isolated areas like many other weddings of the time. A large number of children who suffered from the condition resulted from the first generation of methemoglobinemia among the Fugates. Over the years continued marriages between close relatives such as first cousins, perpetuating the methemoglobinemia gene. Although the consequences of consanguinity were not fully understood at the time, the marriage between Martin and Elizabeth was the first step in a long cycle that would last more than a century. This perpetuation was contributed to by the lack of marriage alternatives outside the community and the geographical isolation of the families, with the genetic condition manifesting more and more with each generation. No perception that the condition was directly linked to the practice of consanguinity existed at first. For the Fugates, the blue skin was simply a family feature, and the following generations did not fully understand the consequences of the genetics involved. However, the stigma was beginning to take shape as the condition spread to more family members. In various ways manifested the condition of the blue skin as the recessive gene was transmitted from generation to generation. Although methemoglobinemia itself was not fatal, it caused health difficulties, especially in extreme situations of lack of oxygenation and increased susceptibility to lung diseases. In addition, a social stigma that the Fugate family members had to endure over the years was generated by the physical condition. As a curiosity, but also with a look of revulsion and fear, began the Fugate family to be seen throughout the generations. Began the surrounding population, upon realizing the peculiar color of the skin of family members, to push them away. Just one of the difficulties faced by the Fugates was the stigma of being different, however. Emotional and psychological problems due to the social isolation and the discrimination they suffered were also faced by the Fugates beyond physical questions. Marginalized and stigmatized by something they could not control was the family, treated with distrust. Only in the 20th century, when the Fugate family descendants began to expand to areas besides Troublesome Creek, began the true impact of methemoglobinemia and its relationship with consanguinity to be understood. Recognized by doctors and geneticists who began to study the case of the family at the time was that the condition was perpetuated due to the continuous practice of consanguineous marriages. An important reference for scientific studies on consanguinity and the genetic effects of methemoglobinemia became the history of the Fugate family. From the 1940s, with the work of geneticists who studied the Fugates, began the concept of recessive genetic conditions to be more widely understood. As a very rare condition which results from the mutation of a specific gene and was associated with consanguinity was methemoglobinemia identified. A greater debate on the effects of consanguinity on physical health was led to by this case, together with other investigations into genetic diseases in isolated communities. A series of questions about how practices such as consanguineous marriages can result in rare genetic conditions and how they affect human development was generated by the research on the case of the Fugates. In importance began studies on human genetics to grow, and a concern in society became the idea of avoiding such practices. An important study on the effects of consanguinity on human health was what started as an isolated case of a bluish skin transformed into. However, the most surprising was the legacy this study left not only for the scientific community but also for society in general. The formation of a new public awareness of inherited genetic conditions was led to by the public revelation on the condition and its social implications, and the Fugates became a reference when discussing the relationship between consanguinity and genetic health. A clear example of how past errors, choices made by generations without understanding genetic effects, can impact the following generations in deep ways is the history of the Fugate family. A warning about the need for genetic education and how isolated communities without the proper knowledge may perpetuate diseases that could be avoided is the case of the Fugates. Not just an example of the consequences of consanguinity is the Fugate family legacy today, but also an alert to the modern world about the importance of education and genetic consciousness. Important questions about social isolation, stigma, and the perpetuation of genetic diseases that are still relevant were raised by the study of their lives and the blue skin condition.